Hi guys and welcome to Crazy Pepper Revenge. This channel is all about crazy true stories, stuff that happens in real life when things get a little bit messy.
My wife stopped acknowledging my existence for exactly 4 weeks. 28 days of complete radio silence. And honestly, it changed everything, just not the way she planned. Let me back up and explain how this mess started, because the ending is going to surprise you. It was an ordinary Tuesday when my world shifted. I walked through the front door after a long shift at work, expecting the usual routine. Instead, I got hit with this oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. Not the comfortable kind of silence you sink into after a rough day, but the deliberate, weaponized kind that makes you feel like you're suffocating. My wife Delilah was planted at the kitchen table, eyes glued to her phone screen like it held the secrets of the universe. I set my keys down on the granite countertop, the metallic clink echoing through the tension. "Hey, how'd your day go?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Absolutely nothing. She didn't even flinch. "Everything all right with you?" I tried again. Still nothing. She might as well have been a statue. Then she stood up, walked right past me like I was invisible, and climbed the stairs. The bedroom door shut with enough force to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Here's what you need to understand about Delilah. She's always had a flair for the dramatic, but this felt different. This felt calculated. The previous night, we'd had what I considered a pretty reasonable conversation about dividing up household tasks. She'd been complaining about doing laundry during the day while I was at the office, even though I handled everything outside, all the car stuff, and most of the financial planning. When I suggested we could redistribute things more evenly, she got upset. But I never imagined she'd resort to this level of childishness. For the next 72 hours, she maintained this bizarre performance. She'd prepare breakfast for herself and leave my dirty dishes piled in the sink. She'd wash her own clothes and leave mine sitting in the hamper. She'd order delivery for one person and eat it directly in front of me without offering a single bite. The most infuriating part? She'd talk to literally everyone else. Her phone would ring, and suddenly she transformed into this bubbly, chatty person with her friends or mother. The second she hung up, I ceased to exist again. By the fourth day, I understood what was really happening. This wasn't about our discussion. This was a power move. She was wielding the silent treatment like a weapon, expecting me to crack, to beg for her forgiveness, to grovel for her attention. I'd watched her do this exact thing to her younger sister at a family barbecue once. The poor woman spent the entire afternoon trying to apologize for some trivial offense while Delilah acted like she was invisible. But here's where she made a critical miscalculation. I'm not her sister. On the fifth day, something interesting happened. I was watching the playoffs in the living room when she came downstairs. She stood there for a solid minute, obviously expecting me to notice her, to try to engage, to show that her silent treatment was having the desired effect. When I didn't look up from the screen, she actually cleared her throat loudly, like she was trying to get a waiter's attention. I kept my eyes on the game. She stomped back upstairs, and I heard her voice carrying through the walls as she talked on the phone with someone. "He's being so incredibly stubborn. Can you believe he's not even trying to fix this?" That's when it clicked for me. She wasn't ignoring me because she was hurt. She was ignoring me because she wanted to train me, like some kind of behavioral conditioning experiment. Give the husband the cold shoulder until he learns to submit completely to whatever she demands. The problem with her strategy? I was starting to realize how peaceful the house had become. No constant nitpicking about how I loaded the dishwasher incorrectly. No complaints about my choice of television programs. No lectures about leaving a coffee mug on the counter for 5 minutes. For the first time in years, I could come home from work and actually decompress. By the end of the first week, I'd made a decision. If she wanted to play games, I'd play along. But not the way she expected. You see, there were things I used to love doing that I'd gradually abandoned because of her constant complaints. Things that made me who I was before I became this version of myself that walked on eggshells around her moods. Music, for instance. I used to be a musician, not just as a hobby, but professionally. I played trumpet in a jazz ensemble for 5 years before we got married. Had a full keyboard set up in what used to be my home studio before it became her craft room that she never actually used for crafts. But over the years, every time I tried to practice, she'd make comments. "That noise is giving me a migraine. Do you have to play that same song over and over?" And my personal favorite, "Are you sure you used to be good at this? Because that doesn't sound right." Those comments cut deep because music wasn't just something I did, it was part of my identity. But little by little, I'd played less and less until my instruments ended up buried in the closet under boxes of her seasonal decorations. Well, if she was going to ignore me completely, that meant she couldn't complain about noise, could she? On the 8th day, I pulled my trumpet out of the closet. The case was covered in dust, and when I opened it, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement. Pure, unfiltered excitement about making music again. I set up in the living room, right where she'd have to walk past to get to the kitchen. Then I started playing. Now, I'll be honest, I was rusty, really rusty. The first few notes were rough, and my embouchure was completely out of practice. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the perfect opportunity for her to make one of her cutting remarks about my musical abilities. But she couldn't. Not without breaking her own rule. Instead, I heard her footsteps stop at the top of the stairs. Then, after about 30 seconds of me working through some basic scales, I heard her bedroom door slam so hard it shook the house. I smiled and kept playing. The next day, I added the keyboard to my practice routine, set it up right in the dining room where the acoustics were better. Spent an hour working through old jazz standards, my fingers slowly remembering the chord progressions I used to play in my sleep. She came downstairs while I was in the middle of take 5, and I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She stood there for a moment, clearly wanting to say something, her face getting redder by the second. When I hit a slightly off note in the bridge, I saw her mouth start to open, probably ready to deliver one of her usual criticisms. But then she remembered her game and snapped it shut. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the front door behind her. I finished the song and realized I felt more like myself than I had in years. By the 10th day, I had established a routine that would have been impossible just 2 weeks earlier. Morning coffee while practicing scales on the keyboard. Evening wind-down sessions with my trumpet. The house filled with music for the first time in years, and she was losing her mind. The silent treatment was supposed to make me desperate for her attention. Instead, I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was this excitement about starting the day that I hadn't felt in forever. I'd brew my coffee, sit at the keyboard, and just play whatever came to mind. Sometimes it was old standards I'd memorized years ago. Sometimes it was just improvisation, letting my fingers explore the keys without any particular destination in mind. The mornings became sacred to me. That hour before work when the house was quiet except for my music, when I could feel myself coming back to life one note at a time. Delilah would eventually come downstairs, and I'd see her pause at the bottom of the stairs listening. But she never said anything. She'd just grab her coffee and retreat back upstairs, and I'd keep playing. Every morning, I'd set up my keyboard in the living room and work through jazz progressions. The muscle memory was coming back faster than I expected. My fingers found their way to familiar chord changes, and suddenly I was playing arrangements I hadn't touched in a decade. I started remembering why I'd fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about being perfect or impressing anyone. It was about expression, about translating emotions into sound, about creating something beautiful out of thin air. All those years I'd let that slip away because it was easier than dealing with her complaints. She'd come downstairs for her morning coffee, see me at the keyboard, and her jaw would clench, but she couldn't say a word. Not without admitting her little psychological warfare wasn't working. I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face every single morning. The desire to criticize, warring with the need to maintain her silent treatment. It was almost comical. The breakthrough came on the 12th day. I was working on a particularly challenging trumpet piece, something with complex runs that required precision. I'd been practicing the same 16 bars for about 20 minutes, slowly building up the tempo. Each time I'd mess up a particular passage, I'd stop, reset, and try again. It was frustrating, but it was also exhilarating. This was the kind of challenge I'd been missing. Not the challenge of trying to predict someone's mood or avoid triggering an argument, but the challenge of mastering something difficult, of pushing myself to improve at something I genuinely cared about. She was in the kitchen, and I could feel the tension radiating from her direction. Every time I hit a wrong note or had to restart, she'd slam something down a little harder than necessary. A coffee mug, a plate, the refrigerator door. It was like She was trying to communicate her frustration through the violence of her movements, since she couldn't use words. Then it happened. I was working through this tricky chromatic run when I completely fumbled it. The notes came out as a squeaky, discordant mess that would have made any jazz musician cringe. She couldn't help herself. Jesus Christ. Are you sure you used to be a musician? Because that sounds like a dying animal. The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before she realized what she'd done. Her eyes went wide and she actually covered her mouth with her hand, like she could somehow take it back. I stopped playing and looked at her calmly. Oh, so you can hear me? Interesting. She turned bright red, spun around, and marched upstairs. I heard her bedroom door slam, followed immediately by the sound of her talking rapidly on her phone. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was clear. She was furious with herself for breaking. But here's the thing that really got to me. Even after weeks of not speaking, her first words were still designed to cut me down, still meant to make me feel small about something I loved. That told me everything I needed to know about where this marriage was really headed. It wasn't just about the silent treatment anymore. It was about the pattern it revealed. The pattern of her needing to diminish me to feel powerful. The pattern of her using emotional manipulation instead of honest communication. The pattern of her making me feel like I had to earn the right to exist in my own space. I picked up my trumpet and played that passage again, perfectly this time. And I realized that I'd just been given a gift. She'd shown me in the clearest possible way that even when she broke her own rules, even when she couldn't help herself, her instinct was still to tear me down. That was who she was. That was who she'd always been. I'd just been too busy trying to keep the peace to see it clearly. The next few days were fascinating to watch. She was clearly struggling with her own rules. The silent treatment was her weapon of choice. But I wasn't reacting the way she wanted. Instead of becoming desperate for her attention, I was thriving in her absence. I could see her getting more and more agitated. She'd walk past me and pause, like she was waiting for me to acknowledge her. When I didn't, she'd huff and storm off. She'd stand in doorways, clearing her throat, trying to get my attention without actually speaking. It was like watching someone try to win a game where they'd already lost but refused to admit it. The thing is, I wasn't ignoring her out of spite. I was just genuinely busy living my life. I had music to practice, projects to work on, meals to cook. For the first time in years, my attention was focused on things that brought me joy rather than on managing her emotions. And that shift in focus was everything. I started expanding beyond just music. Remember that woodworking bench I'd set up in the garage 3 years ago? She'd complained it was too messy, too noisy, too much of a waste of time and money. Well, with no complaints coming my way, I fired up the table saw for the first time in months. The sound echoed through the house, and I heard her bedroom door slam again. But I kept working, building a small bookshelf I'd been planning for years. The satisfaction of creating something with my hands, combined with the freedom to do it without constant criticism, was intoxicating. There's something deeply satisfying about woodworking. The smell of fresh-cut wood, the precision of measuring and cutting, the way a project slowly takes shape under your hands. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it. I'd forgotten how good it felt to create something tangible, something that would last. I spent hours in that garage, losing myself in the work. And every time I heard her footsteps approaching, every time I sensed her watching me from the doorway, I felt a little more certain about what I needed to do. I also reclaimed the television. For years, I'd come home to find her watching reality shows or romantic comedies. If I wanted to catch a game or watch something I actually enjoyed, I'd have to negotiate or wait until she was done. But now, I walked in, grabbed the remote, and put on whatever I wanted. She'd storm into the room, see me watching a basketball game, and storm right back out. It was such a small thing, but it represented something bigger. The ability to make simple choices about my own leisure time without having to justify them or negotiate them or feel guilty about them. The ability to just exist in my own space without constantly considering someone else's preferences above my own. I started noticing all these little ways I'd been accommodating her over the years. The way I'd mute the television when she was on the phone, even though she never extended the same courtesy to me. The way I'd always ask if she minded before I did anything, while she just did whatever she wanted. The way I'd apologize for things that weren't my fault, just to keep the peace. All of that stopped. Not out of spite, but out of a simple realization that I didn't need to live that way anymore. The really telling moment came on the 16th day. I was in the middle of an evening practice session, working through some Miles Davis arrangements on my trumpet. The music was flowing, and I was completely in the zone. She came downstairs, clearly intending to walk through the living room to the kitchen, but stopped when she saw me playing. For just a moment, I caught something different in her expression. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was almost like she was seeing me for the first time in years. The man she married had been a musician. The man she'd been living with had been a subdued version who'd given up his passions to keep the peace. I wondered if she was remembering our early dates when I'd take her to jazz clubs and she'd watch me play with what looked like admiration. Back when my music was something she bragged about to her friends instead of something she complained about to anyone who would listen. Back when she seemed to love the parts of me that made me different instead of trying to sand them all down until I fit her idea of what a husband should be. But then, the moment passed, and her face hardened again. She turned and went back upstairs, and I heard her on the phone again. This time, I could make out some of the conversation. "He's doing this just to spite me, I know it. Playing that stupid instrument every single day. He knows how much I hate it." There it was. She didn't hate the music because it was actually bothersome. She hated it because it represented something she couldn't control, something that was mine, that brought me joy, that didn't center around her. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in my living room with my trumpet across my lap and realized something profound. I'd spent so many years trying to be the husband she wanted that I'd forgotten who I actually was. The silent treatment wasn't punishment, it was liberation. For the first time in our marriage, I was living like myself in my own house, making the choices I wanted to make, doing the things that brought me fulfillment. And the best part? She couldn't say a word about it without admitting her little game wasn't working. I picked up my trumpet and played one more song before bed, a slow, soulful ballad that filled the house with music she'd spent years silencing. And for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep completely content. By the 18th day, I wasn't just practicing music anymore. I was systematically reclaiming every aspect of my life that I'd surrendered over the years. And she was watching it happen in complete silence, trapped by her own game. The living room was first. For years, she'd arranged the furniture to face her preferred television setup, angled toward the wall, where she could watch her shows while doing crafts she never actually finished. The couch was positioned so awkwardly that watching sports meant craning your neck at an uncomfortable angle. Well, not anymore. I spent a Saturday morning rearranging everything. Couch directly facing the television, coffee table, at the perfect height for putting my feet up, my trumpet stand positioned right beside my favorite chair. When she came downstairs and saw the new layout, she stood there for a full minute, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She wanted to complain. I could see it building up inside her, but she couldn't say a word without breaking her precious silent treatment. Instead, she grabbed her purse and left the house for 3 hours. When she came back, I was settled into my newly positioned chair, watching the game with my feet up on the coffee table, something she'd always told me was trashy and disrespectful to the furniture. She stood in the doorway, clearly expecting me to feel guilty about taking up space in my own home. I didn't even look up from the television. The kitchen was next. She'd always insisted on keeping the counters completely clear of everything except her decorative canisters that served no actual purpose. My coffee maker had to live in the pantry because she thought it was too cluttered to leave it out. My vitamins and supplements had to be hidden in a cabinet because they ruined the aesthetic. Not anymore. I set up a proper coffee station on the counter, my coffee maker, grinder, selection of beans, everything easily accessible for my morning routine. My supplements got their own designated spot. I even brought out the blender I'd wanted to use for protein shakes, but had been banned because it was too bulky. Every morning I'd make my coffee right there in plain sight, and she'd have to walk around my setup to get to her precious aesthetic sink. The frustration was written all over her face. But what could she do? Tell me I couldn't use my own kitchen? The real breakthrough came when I started cooking the food I actually wanted to eat. For years, dinner had been whatever she was in the mood for. Usually some Pinterest recipe that looked pretty but tasted bland. I'd suggest alternatives, but she'd always have some reason why my preferences were wrong. Too spicy, too unhealthy, too complicated, too simple. But now, I'd come home and cook exactly what I wanted. Spicy Mexican food that filled the house with the smell of cumin and chili powder. Indian curries that she'd always claimed were too exotic. Even simple comfort food like burgers and fries, things she'd banned because they were beneath us. She'd smell the food cooking and hover around the kitchen, clearly wanting some. But since she was pretending I didn't exist, she couldn't exactly ask for a plate. Instead, she'd make herself a sad little salad and eat it while the smell of my delicious dinner filled the air. The garage became my personal sanctuary. I'd set up my woodworking station and started spending evenings out there, building things I'd been planning for years. A proper workbench, storage shelves, a guitar stand I'd been meaning to make since before we were married. The sound of my power tools echoed through the house every evening, and I'd see her silhouette in the kitchen window watching me work. Sometimes she'd pace back and forth, clearly agitated by the noise and activity. But she couldn't complain, not without talking to me. One evening I was working on a jewelry box, just a small project to keep my hands busy, when she appeared in the garage doorway. She stood there for several minutes, watching me measure and cut. I could tell she wanted to say something, maybe even wanted to ask what I was making. But she turned and walked away without a word. The next morning, I found a passive-aggressive note on the kitchen counter. The noise from the garage is disturbing the neighbors. I read it, smiled, and threw it in the trash. Then I went to the garage and spent an extra hour working on my projects, making sure to use the loudest tools I had. By the 22nd day, the house felt completely different. It felt like mine again. The music, the comfortable furniture arrangement, the freedom to eat what I wanted, the ability to pursue my hobbies without constant criticism. All of it combined to create something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Real, genuine peace in my own home. I'd wake up each morning without the knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering what mood she'd be in or what I'd inevitably do wrong. Instead, I'd wake up looking forward to my coffee, my music practice, and whatever project I felt like tackling that day. I started sleeping better too. For years, I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, wondering if I'd said the wrong thing, planning how to avoid conflict the next day. But now I'd fall asleep easily, my mind quiet and content. I'd dream about music, about projects I wanted to build, and about possibilities instead of problems. My friends started noticing the change too. I'd been gradually isolating myself over the years, turning down invitations because it was easier than dealing with her complaints about me going out. But now I started saying yes again. I'd meet up with old buddies for drinks, go to jazz shows, spend Saturday afternoons at the hardware store, planning my next woodworking project. One of my oldest friends, Trevor, pulled me aside after we'd been hanging out for a couple hours. "Man, I don't know what's going on with you, but you seem different, like actually happy. I haven't seen you like this in years." I didn't tell him about the silent treatment. I just smiled and said, "Yeah, I'm figuring some things out." The silent treatment that was supposed to punish me had become the greatest gift she'd ever given me. I was living like a bachelor in my own house, but without the loneliness. Because I finally had something I'd been missing for years, myself. And the best part, every day that passed, every small freedom I reclaimed, every moment of genuine contentment I experienced was making it clearer what my next move needed to be. She thought she was training me to submit. Instead, she was showing me exactly what my life could look like without her constant interference. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Day 25 changed everything. I was in my garage, putting the finishing touches on a cedar jewelry box I'd been working on when I heard her on the phone again, but this time the conversation was different. "It's been almost a month and he's acting like he doesn't even care. He's actually happier. Can you believe that? I'm giving him the silent treatment and he's walking around the house like he won the lottery." She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. "No, you don't understand. He's playing music all day, rearranging furniture, cooking whatever he wants. It's like he's pretending I don't even live here anymore." Another pause. Then her voice got sharper. "Of course it's bothering me. This was supposed to make him realize how much he needs me. Instead, he's acting like he's better off without me." That was the moment I realized she'd accidentally revealed the truth. This wasn't about our argument. This wasn't about household chores or respect or any of the surface level issues we'd been dancing around for years. This was about control, pure and simple. She'd been using emotional manipulation to keep me in line, and when I'd finally pushed back on something minor, she'd escalated to the nuclear option. The silent treatment was her way of saying, "See what happens when you don't do exactly what I want," but instead of breaking me down, it had built me up. Instead of making me desperate for her approval, It had reminded me what it felt like to live without constantly seeking it. I set down my sandpaper and walked into the house. She was still on the phone in the kitchen, pacing back and forth with nervous energy. I don't know what to do. Tomorrow makes it 4 weeks, and I was planning to end it then. But if I break first, doesn't that mean he wins? She noticed me in the doorway and quickly lowered her voice. I have to go. He's here. She hung up and looked at me expectantly, like maybe I'd finally cracked and was ready to grovel. When I just grabbed a glass of water and headed back to the garage, her face fell. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I sat in my living room with my trumpet and made a decision. If she wanted to play games, I'd give her a game she'd never forget. But first, I needed to make some preparations. The next morning, I took a personal day from work. After she left for her job, I drove across town to a law office I'd looked up online. The attorney was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in divorce cases. How can I help you? She asked after we'd settled into her office. I need to understand my options. My wife has been giving me the silent treatment for almost a month, and I've realized some things about our marriage that I can't ignore. She listened as I explained the situation. Not just the recent silent treatment, but the years of gradual erosion of my identity, the constant criticism, the way I'd stopped doing things I loved to avoid conflict, the realization that I'd been living like a guest in my own home. It sounds like you've already made your decision, she said when I finished. I think I have, but I want to do this right, clean, fair, and final. We spent 2 hours going over everything. Assets, debts, the house, our separate careers. Since we didn't have kids and had kept most of our finances separate, it would be relatively straightforward. She prepared the initial paperwork while I waited. When do you want to serve these? She asked, sliding the documents across her desk. Tomorrow morning, day 29. I wanted to be memorable. On the drive home, I stopped at a florist. I needed something specific. Flowers that looked beautiful but carried the right message. The clerk suggested white roses. They represent new beginnings, she explained. Perfect. That evening, I practiced my trumpet longer than usual. I played some of my favorite pieces, letting the music fill the house one more time. She was upstairs, probably planning her grand return to speaking tomorrow, thinking she'd finally won her psychological war. If only she knew what was coming. I spent the evening writing 2 notes. The first one took me several drafts to get right. It needed to be clever enough to catch her off guard, but not so obvious that she'd immediately understand what was happening. The second note was easier, more direct, more final. As I sealed the divorce papers in an envelope, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete certainty, not anxiety, not doubt, not the usual second guessing that had paralyzed me for so long. Just calm, clear certainty that I was making the right choice. The silent treatment was supposed to teach me a lesson about what happens when I don't submit to her will. Instead, it had taught me something far more valuable. What my life could look like when I stopped trying to manage her emotions and started honoring my own needs. Tomorrow, she'd discover that her month-long experiment in psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly. Instead of training a more obedient husband, she'd created a man who was ready to walk away entirely. I went to bed early, setting my alarm for dawn. Day 29 was going to be unforgettable. Day 29 arrived like any other morning, except I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done. I started my day the same way I had for the past 3 weeks, with music. I set up my trumpet in the living room and played a slow, deliberate jazz standard. The notes filled the house, and I heard her stirring upstairs. She was probably lying in bed, planning her grand return to speaking, imagining how grateful I'd be when she finally ended her punishment. She had no idea what was waiting for her. After my practice session, I arranged the white roses in a simple vase and placed them on the kitchen table with the first note folded neatly beside them. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The message was perfectly crafted to catch her completely off guard. Then I went back to my morning routine. Coffee, newspaper, trumpet practice round 2. Acting like it was just another peaceful day in my newly reclaimed house. She came downstairs around 8:30, dressed for work, but moving slowly. I could see her preparing mentally for whatever dramatic revelation she had planned. Maybe she was going to act like the silent treatment had been some kind of test that I'd passed. Maybe she was going to pretend the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. She walked into the kitchen and froze when she saw the flowers. I watched from the living room as she approached the table cautiously. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the note and unfolded it. I'd written it in my best handwriting, making sure every word was clear. Thank you for the best month of our marriage. Her face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion first, then a smile started to form as she misunderstood the message, then confusion again as she reread it. Then the smile returned, bigger this time, like she thought I was finally acknowledging that her silent treatment had been effective. She actually looked pleased with herself. You think this is funny? She said, breaking her silence with a voice full of righteous indignation. After everything you've put me through these past weeks. I kept playing my trumpet, not even looking in her direction. I'm talking to you, she continued, her voice getting louder. Don't you dare ignore me now. I finished the song I was playing, set down my instrument, and looked at her calmly. Oh, so you can talk now? I thought you'd forgotten how. Her face flushed red. This isn't a joke. Do you have any idea what you've done to our marriage? Actually, I do. I stood up and walked into the kitchen where she was still holding my note. I've had 28 days to think about exactly what our marriage has become. And you're right. This isn't funny at all. She looked confused again, like she was trying to figure out if this was the reaction she'd wanted or not. That note, I continued, pointing to the paper in her hands, isn't sarcasm. I genuinely mean it. These past 28 days have been the best our marriage has ever been. What are you talking about? Think about it. No fighting, no constant criticism, no walking on eggshells, no having to justify why I want to play music in my own house. For the first time in years, I've been able to just exist without having to manage your emotions every single second. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. But here's the thing. I figured out why these 28 days were so perfect. It wasn't because we weren't talking. It was because I was finally living like myself again. And that made me realize something important. I walked over to the counter where I'd left the second envelope earlier that morning, right next to the coffee maker she'd always hated seeing. If 28 days without your input made our marriage better, imagine what a lifetime could do. I handed her the envelope. She took it with shaking hands, and I could see the exact moment she realized this wasn't going the way she'd planned. The envelope was thick, official looking. Her name was written on the front in the same careful handwriting as the first note. What is this? She whispered. Open it. She tore open the envelope, and I watched her face as she saw the divorce papers. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then back to the first, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. She found the second note clipped to the back of the legal documents. This one was shorter, more direct. Now let's make it the best year of my life. The silence that followed was different from the calculated quiet of the past month. This was the silence of complete shock. She looked from the papers to me to the flowers to the papers again, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. This is insane. Over one argument? Over me not talking to you for a few weeks? This isn't about one argument. This is about what the past 28 days taught me. You wanted to show me what life would be like without your attention. Mission accomplished. I liked it better than I ever imagined possible. She slammed the papers down on the table. You can't just end our marriage because I gave you the silent treatment. I'm not ending our marriage because of the silent treatment. I'm ending it because the silent treatment was the first time in years I felt free in my own home. And that tells me everything I need to know about what we've become. I picked up my trumpet case and headed toward the door. Where are you going? To work. The difference is, when I come home tonight, I won't have to wonder what mood you'll be in or what rules will have changed while I was gone. I'll just come home and live my life. I paused at the door and looked back at her one more time. By the way, your silent treatment officially ends today. You can talk all you want now, just not to me. The divorce was finalized exactly 90 days later, 3 months that felt like the best period of my adult life. She tried everything in those final weeks. Tears, bargaining, anger, promises to change. She even offered to let me practice music whenever I wanted, as if that had been the real issue all along. But I'd learned something valuable during those 28 days of silence. I'd learned what peace felt like, what it was like to wake up without anxiety, what it meant to live authentically in my own space. The day I signed the final papers, I came home to a house that was completely mine. No more walking on eggshells, No more managing someone else's emotions. No more sacrificing pieces of myself to keep an artificial peace. That evening, I set up both my keyboard and trumpet in the living room. I played for 3 straight hours, everything from Miles Davis to some original compositions I'd been working on. The music filled every corner of the house, and for the first time in years, nobody was there to tell me it was too loud, too repetitive, or too amateur. 6 months later, I joined a local jazz ensemble. We play at small venues around the city, and I've rediscovered why music was such a central part of who I used to be. The other musicians are amazed when I tell them I'd stopped playing for years. "How do you just stop making music?" one of them asked. I didn't have a good answer for that, but I know I'll never make that mistake again. My house has become exactly what a home should be. Comfortable furniture arranged for my convenience, a proper music room where I can practice without judgment, a garage workshop where I build things that serve actual purposes, a kitchen where I cook food I actually enjoy eating. Sometimes people ask if I miss being married. The honest answer is no. I don't miss that marriage. I don't miss the constant criticism disguised as concern. I don't miss the emotional manipulation packaged as communication. I don't miss feeling like a stranger in my own home. What I have now is better than what I had before. I have a life built around my own values, my own interests, my own choices. I have friendships that aren't filtered through someone else's approval. I have hobbies that bring me genuine joy instead of stress about whether they're acceptable. The silent treatment that was supposed to punish me ended up being the greatest gift she ever gave me. It showed me what freedom felt like. It reminded me who I was underneath all the compromises and accommodations. And when she finally broke that silence on day 29, expecting to find a broken man ready to submit, she found something else entirely. She found a man who'd remembered his worth, reclaimed his space, and decided he deserved better. Last thing I said to her during the divorce proceedings was simple. "You wanted to teach me what life was like without your attention. Thank you for the lesson. It was exactly what I needed." These days, I fall asleep to the sound of silence. Not the manipulative kind, but the peaceful kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be.